Fear is a powerful thing, and it's motivating many to leave a city called Kherson.
A senior Ukrainian official says that Russian forces are digging in and preparing to defend the partially occupied southern region of Kherson.
That's an end of the line around the city of Kherson that remains the most interest and has been the most covered by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense today.
So Kherson city itself is the capital of the Kherson Oblast, which was one of the first major cities captured by the Russians in their renewed offensive in February of 2022. Kherson, which was relatively close to the Crimean Peninsula, was one of the first targets of the Russian army, very quickly fell. The Ukrainians were forced to fall back. However, in the months since then, the Ukrainians have kept up pressure on the Russians, even in Kherson province, or Kherson Oblast itself, whereas the Russians were focused in Donetsk and Luhansk, as well as in those initial months trying to actually close with and capture Kyiv itself, the capital of Ukraine. The Ukrainians were very methodically preparing the environment in Kherson for their eventual counteroffensive. Now the Russians have been forced to shift a lot of their reinforcements and emphasis back over to the Kharkiv region to try to stabilize in Donetsk, which has then created the opportunity for the Ukrainians to make more rapid advances in Kherson. We've seen sabotage against major infrastructure, specifically transportation infrastructure upon which the Russians were reliant to resupply their forces in Kherson, as well as the identification and destruction, oftentimes by Western-supplied HIMARS rockets, of the command and control nodes that the Russians are reliant upon in Kherson Oblast. If the Russians establish a new defensive line on the east bank of the Dnipro River before winter and dig in effectively and prevent the Ukrainians from establishing a bridgehead across the river, then that could potentially become the new front line for probably most of the winter. However, if the Ukrainians surprise us, as they have multiple times over, and establish an effective bridgehead across the Dnipro River, then we could see the Russians forced to fall back to the Crimea Peninsula itself and probably further east to Melitopol, where they might be able to establish new defensive lines and actually hold for some months, with, of course, Vladimir Putin's ultimate intent being to establish these defensive lines and hold as much territory as he can going into the winter, at which point the lines will probably generally solidify. So from a tactical perspective, the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam would have certain advantages for the Russians, particularly in the covering of their withdrawal from Kherson city proper. The destruction of the dam would basically turn the river valley into an impassable morass of mud, particularly as we head into the winter, which would slow down any Ukrainian counteroffensive and probably make it near impossible for continued operations towards Crimea or Melitopol. However, I think that kind of ignores the strategic impact of the destruction of that dam, specifically the huge economic and ecological damage that would be caused, thereby making continued negotiations between Ukraine and Russia nearly impossible. Moreover, it would also signify that Putin's basically given up on ever reconquering Kherson city or the rest of the Kherson Oblast, because his forces would then certainly be in no position to advance across that same terrain that's then been flooded by the destruction of the dam. The flooding of that terrain, particularly as temperatures drop, would have a huge humanitarian effect, particularly in the downstream villages and cities, which would then be flooded and basically cut off from any sort of reliable outside support. I think the destruction of the dam would probably fundamentally change the war in the south probably for the next several months, particularly as we go into winter. I could not imagine Kyiv being even willing at that point to have negotiations with Putin or the Kremlin about trying to end the war on Russia's terms, particularly given the amount of just economic damage that would be done. So I just would see the destruction of the dam as basically being a last-ditch effort by the Russians as they withdraw to basically make the area uninhabitable and untenable for a significant period of time, months if not years.